gives me great pleasure to introduce the second deep conversation for Creative Innovation 2012. And what enthusiasm I introduce this man with, the incredible Robyn Williams, with a legacy to the ABC Science Show. He is one in a million. I was absolutely rapt when he said yes, that he'd like to come and moderate this deep conversation. Robyn Williams.
Thank you. Terrific to see you. We're going to be talking about innovation, in other words, the wicked problems and how science and technology may solve them. And I've got two problems with innovation. One of them as a broadcaster, and that's the gap between what we put on the radio and television of these fantastic breakthroughs. They call them breakthroughs. I hesitate to use that word. The gap between those things and what you can actually get when you go somewhere like the hospital or when you go to get things fixed. The promise and the reality, the gap. I had a couple of personal experiences myself. I had 3 cardiac arrests in 1988, and they fixed me by putting a pacemaker in my chest, which is wonderful, very clever and Australian. And being a lousy patient, I got bored with going to have it checked. So, you know, you turn up and all these old people and they're worried, and I'm busy. And so I race in and I race out, and I forget for 3 years. And when I go back, they've forgotten what it is. And so I didn't bother to go back anymore. And 22 years later, out of some crowded party comes a surgeon who said he put it in me. And I said, well, they're supposed to last for 7 years. This one's been in for 22. Unless it's nuclear powered, what's it doing? He said, you better come and have a check. And I went to the hospital, and he said it's been dead for 15 years. So there's this gap between the whiz-bang technology and actually what happens. Why has it been dead for 15 years? What's it been doing? Who knows? I just make science programs. A few years later, I happened to be in Finland, and I had to pee in a snowdrift, as one does, and it was the colour of borscht. And so I phoned my friend Norman Swan, who does things on the health report, was flown back, and here was whiz-bang technology. It's called WillyCam. They put one of those cameras down whichever's appropriate part. In my case, it was the WillyCam, and they find out where the tumour is, and they take it out, and you go back to work a day later. I was very lucky. Had I not done that, I wouldn't be here. The second aspect that really strikes me as interesting to do with innovation, which is a series that we're doing on radio, which is presented by the Professor of Innovation at the University of Queensland, is the lack of collaboration. People may be very clever. They may be wonderful in science and technology and in business, and who knows, in government. And there may be some very willing people, members of the public, but working together, he says, just doesn't happen. So maybe those two themes will be obvious in our discussion this evening. First of all, let me introduce one by one our guests. First of all, Baroness Susan Greenfield from Oxford. There she is. If you wouldn't mind sitting in there. She's over there. Director of the Institute of the Future of Mind and Professor of Pharmacology at Oxford. How do you see some of these wicked problems and how science and technology may in fact help them or hinder them?
So this is my 5 minutes. I'll stand up, shall I?
Please do.
Because you stood up. Okay. So, evening everyone. So as you hear, I'm a neuroscientist, and therefore I will address that issue through the prism of neuroscience, and more particularly the advances on the human body and the human brain. And on the face of it, everything looks fantastic because biotechnology is marching on with the promise, at least in our so-called developed world, of living a longer and healthier life. So just let's unpack that a little bit. Pharmaceutical targets have now gone up from 400 to 4,000. Everyone's familiar with the genetic technologies, which are enabling now bespoke so-called pharmacogenomics, where you can have your genetic profile showing certain predispositions and therefore determining the kind of drugs that could be prescribed for you and you alone that minimizes side effects and possibly even can pick up things before they've gone too far. Everyone's heard about stem cells, so-called regenerative medicine, where now you can replace damaged tissue. A whole new type of approach where these stem cells will obligingly convert into liver cells or brain cells so that you can actually have them all fresh and working. So the advances in technology, in biotechnology, are undeniable. And where could be the downside? Well, let's just think about some of the issues. What's very interesting about the biotechnology is that whether you like it or not, it will also affect how you look. We all know if you're healthy, you look better, you look younger. Surely that's a good thing. But are we now perhaps becoming less tolerant of deviations in the ears that might stick out, the nose that might be a tad too large, the mole on the left earlobe or something like this? Are we going to be in a situation where, because we have the ability, the technology, to also extend into appearance, that this might lead to a certain, I don't know, fascism almost of how one could look? There'd be an intolerance. If that's the case, are we then going to be all more standardized in our appearance if we are subscribing, if we're the beneficiary of these technologies, where our identity, which previously we thought of as our faces, may not be the case? Reproductive technology, again, very exciting on the one hand. We now know that we can freeze eggs, soon possibly thaw them very easily so that a postmenopausal woman would be able to have a child. Let's take that further. If you could extract genetic material from any cell in the body and combine it with anyone else's, then anyone of any age or sexual orientation could have a child with anyone else of any age or sexual orientation. Now, this would mean slightly more complex attitude to childbirth. You'd have to have IVF, which would mean someone would have to donate an egg and someone would have to donate a womb. But nonetheless, you can envisage a world where potentially a child would have 6 parents, the 2 genetic donors, the donor of the egg, the donor of the womb, and perhaps 2 separate people who may have brought the child up. So some people might not like that or feel that that's a rather strange idea. It's the kind of things that we have to consider. Another issue is with work. We all know, well, certainly in my country, the UK, where we are very hard pressed for funds, that the pension age, as in other countries, is being raised. I would suggest to you that soon governments will latch on to the idea that it's very good for the brain that you should be working, and therefore pensions will be abolished altogether because there's no longer a premium on physical strength or mobility, and so therefore why not stay at home? And instead of playing cards with your friends, why not work at the computer, say, do something like this. Now, put all that together, one could be facing a world where the things that normally demarcate one generation from another are actually quite blurred. Normally when you meet someone, you'll evaluate them in terms of how healthy they are, how they look, their reproductive status, and whether or not they're working. And traditionally in life, we go through this narrative of being a child, a parent, a grandparent, and perhaps a great-grandparent, with all the attributes, all the pros and cons that each of those generations will present. But imagine if those things were blurred, so that you'd grow up, you'd look pretty uniform for the rest of your life, standardized sort of face, you'd be healthy pretty much for the rest of your life, you could reproduce throughout your whole life. A child could actually have a child, a grandfather could have a child with another grandfather, anyone could have children. So you'd reproduce the whole of your life, and then you'd die. Or you'd work for the whole of your life, of course, and then you'd die, just like that. So you'd have a homogeneous life like that. Yeah. Now, I know that sounds very futuristic, but those technologies are pretty much with us now, and therefore I think they're the kind of scenarios we should think about. The other two issues, very briefly, to the impediment to a long and healthy life. Can I do this? Yeah. One is dementia, which is what I actually work on. I'll happily talk about that forever if anyone has any questions in the Q&A session. In the UK, I don't know the figures for Australia, by the middle of this century, 2 million people will be suffering from dementia. And if you ask how many people love you in the world, or even like you a bit, say 10 people like you or love you, for whom you mean something, that would mean 20 million people by the middle of this century whose lives are turned upside down in a way that, devastating though they are, people involved with people suffering from cancer or heart disease do not have that experience. They don't have that same sense of loss. So this issue of dementia is one I say that we can talk about. My own view given there hasn't been a drug developed for dementia for the last 15 years, is that we still have that as one of our biggest challenges. But the ultimate challenge, and I'll end on this ultimate challenge, is let's say we get rid of dementia. Let's say you're living your long and healthy life, even before the weird scenario of having this homogeneous existence. Even before all that, a much more immediate problem is, what are you going to do with the second 50 years of your life? If science and technology has delivered you a relatively pain-free existence where you're mobile, you're healthy, you're active, what are you going to do? Are you going to just play Sudoku and golf? Or are you going to just play video games? Or could we not start to design an environment, because this is something we need to think about as a society, that will deliver for the second half of your life, perhaps even a more fulfilling experience than the first half of your life? And I think that's doable, but it's only doable if we work out what it is that we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan.